Right now, you're wearing something you didn't really choose. You grabbed it half asleep this morning and walked out the door covered, like every human before you, in every culture, every era we have records for. You assume the reason is obvious: cold, modesty, protection. None of that is the real reason humans started covering their bodies, and the actual answer reaches into the part of your brain that knows it is being watched. Let's start with the timeline, because it breaks the first assumption immediately. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years, but the physical evidence for clothing, things like bone needles and hide scraping tools, only begins showing up around 100,000 years ago. That means for well over half of human existence, we were essentially uncovered, living under the same hot sun, dealing with thorns and insects and cold desert nights with nothing but skin, which already rules out the most obvious answer. Warmth came later. Clothing shows up while humans were still in warm climates, long before anyone needed insulation from snow. So maybe it was protection. Thorns, scrapes, biting insects, rough ground. That explanation feels reasonable until you look at where clothing actually started on the body. If protection were the driving force, the first covering should have appeared on hands and feet, the parts that take the most physical damage. Instead, across nearly every early culture, the torso and groin were covered first, the areas least exposed to actual injury. That is not a practical decision. That is something else entirely. Then there is the strangest piece of evidence in this entire story, and it comes from lice. In 2003, a team of geneticists studied something almost nobody thinks about: the genetic split between head lice and body lice. Head lice live in hair. Body lice can only survive in fabric. They cannot exist without it. By tracing when these two lice species genetically diverged from each other, scientists could estimate when humans started wearing clothing consistently enough for an entirely new parasite species to evolve around it. The number that came back was roughly 170,000 years ago. Not a needle. Not a tool. A parasite gave us the oldest reliable timestamp for clothing in human history. But that number only tells us when the behavior was already widespread. It does not explain why it started. For that, you have to go somewhere researchers rarely look: into the structure of human thought itself. In 2009, archaeologist Ian Gilligan published research arguing that clothing was never primarily a practical invention. It was a cognitive one. To wear something, you have to imagine a future version of yourself who is cold, or seen, or in danger, and then act now to protect that future person. That requires memory, planning, and imagining a moment that has not happened yet. No other animal does this. A chimpanzee does not look at a leaf and consider whether it might be useful next week. We did. The first time a human wrapped an animal hide around their body, they were proving, physically, that they could think ahead. But underneath even that is something researchers almost never say out loud: shame. Not in a religious sense, in a neurological one. The awareness that you are being watched, evaluated, perceived by someone else's eyes. Psychologists call this theory of mind: the ability to imagine yourself from outside your own head. Dogs do not have it. Crows do not have it. Even chimpanzees, our closest relatives, show only the faintest traces of it. But somewhere in our evolutionary past, humans developed this fully: the ability to see themselves the way others see them. And the moment that ability switched on, covering the body stopped being only about survival. It became about identity, about control over how you were perceived. The first person who wrapped skin around themselves was not only staying warm, they were deciding, for the first time, how they wanted to be seen. You can see this shift preserved in the ground itself. In 1955, archaeologists excavating a site called Sungir in Russia uncovered two burials nearly 34,000 years old. The bodies were covered in over 10,000 carved ivory beads, arranged in such precise patterns that researchers could reconstruct the shape of the clothing they had been sewn onto: tailored shirts, trousers, even fitted caps. This was not survival gear. Sewing 10,000 beads by hand takes thousands of hours. Someone spent a significant portion of their life decorating how two people would be seen, even in death. That is not protection. That is identity, preserved for 34,000 years. That idea never left us. You can see it everywhere, even in places where clothing was never needed for warmth at all, deep in the Amazon, across Pacific islands, in regions with no cold season whatsoever. People still painted their skin, wore beads, decorated themselves with feathers and fiber and ink. The body was never just a body. Researchers studying these patterns have found something consistent across unrelated cultures. The drive to decorate and cover the body intensifies as social groups grow more complex, as strangers begin meeting strangers, as hierarchies form. Clothing became a form of communication before language could carry the same weight. What you wore told people who you were, which group claimed you, whether you were a threat, an equal, or someone beneath them. Clothing is one of the oldest languages humans ever built, and this is the part that applies to you directly, right now. Every morning you get dressed without thinking much about the decision, but your brain is running something ancient underneath that routine. You are not simply selecting fabric, you are constructing a version of yourself to send out into the world, negotiating between who you are, who you want to appear to be, and what the moment demands of you. That small flicker of anxiety when you realize you are dressed wrong for where you are standing, that is not a modern insecurity. That is 170,000 years of social instinct quietly switching on. We solved cold a long time ago. We solved physical protection a long time ago. But clothing never stopped evolving, because it was never really about the body, it was about the mind that knows it is being watched. We did not start covering ourselves because we were cold. We started because we became aware that someone else was looking, and that awareness never left. Tomorrow morning, you will get dressed exactly like you always do. But underneath that ordinary moment, something far older will still be running. You will not just be choosing clothes. You will be choosing how to be seen, the same instinct your ancestors carried around their first fire, 170,000 years ago.